Yeah, I mean, Second Peter alludes to 1,000 years is but a day to Christ, and it's you're mentioning that.
Yeah, but it's not a year for a day, though.
Right, exactly. But in regards to the argument against amillennialism, and I'm going to use Irenaeus here. If you ever read Against Heresies, that's Irenaeus, and Irenaeus studied with Polycarp, and Polycarp studied with John. Right. And if you've ever heard of the game telephone, the further away that you get away from the source, by the time you get to if you have 20 people in the game telephone, by the time it gets usually to the fifth or sixth, it's already messed up in some kind of way, whatever it was originally said. And that's kind of the way I view eschatology, which I believe that RK and I have a good grasp on. I believe the further away you get from the original fathers of the church, I think the more skewed it becomes. Irenaeus looked at the 6 or the 7 days of creation as being a representation of how long the earth would last before Christ returned. It kind of was like a sort of map, if you will, of how this was all going to play out. So in other words, like obviously creation, with the 6 days of creation, that was in the beginning. Then you go some 2,000 years later, and then you get the covenant with Abraham for the many, which RK and I and the amillennialists all believe it has nothing to do with the people of Israel and an everlasting covenant, but that it has to do with the seed of one, which is Galatians 3.
Galatians 3:16.
Yes, and and then that covenant that was made with Abraham was confirmed. This is where I go to Daniel 9:27. That was confirmed at the cross.
Amen.
And at some 2,000 years later. So now what we're looking at, I'm going to kind of use Irenaeus' thought process here. If you take the idea of 1,000 years is but a day to God, you're looking at a 2-day interval from the creation to whenever he made that covenant with Abraham. And then forget AD and BC and AD and all that. We're just looking at creation to where we are now. You go 4,000 years, and then you have Jesus Christ. So that's another 2,000 years worth of biblical history for Israel, with the prophets and with the feast and the sacrifices and all the foreshadowing of Christ. That's what people miss a lot of times. Everything that Israel was doing was a foreshadow of Christ. Even events that happened during the 2,000 years were foreshadow of many times of end-time events. Or like, for instance, Jesus references Jonah, and being the heart of the earth is a reference to Jonah. It seems to me that Jonah is the whole story of Jonah is just merely, it happened to be a representation of Jesus dying on the cross, going in the heart of earth for 3 days, and then being resurrected on the third day. Well, that matches what happened whenever a great fish was prepared for Jonah, and then Jonah was in the belly of the fish for 3 days. And then what did he do right after that? He went and he preached to the Gentiles to turn from their ways, which is exactly what happened after Jesus was resurrected. We got the gospel after that. So, and that was year 4,000. Now you flash forward another 2,000 years, right? Now we're coming up on the 6th day. So we've 6,000 years, according to the Bible, 360 days a year. I don't know if I'm exactly right on this, but we're somewhere around the 6,000 mark or over it.
We're over it.
We're over it. So you're looking at now we're ready for Christ to return. That's why I believe this show is so important, is because I do believe that Irenaeus has a very valid point. And if you listen to Peter when he's speaking in 2 Peter 3, he's talking about end times. He references the flood. He's referencing that there will be scoffers in the last days. We're talking about how people saying, when is he coming? And so the whole nature of 2 Peter 3 is to say, listen, it's going to take a little time. 1,000 years is but a day to the Lord, which matches biblical history of how God's done things. To me, of course, the flood is significant, but not nearly as significant as the promise made to Abraham, because that's what the Bible is about, salvation in Jesus Christ. So to me, that at year 2000, when you get to year 2000 and you see that covenant made with Abraham, that's significant in Genesis 12. Right, and then of course, going on Genesis, he adds to the covenant. What was promised to the Israelites was the land if they were obedient, not eternal salvation for every individual in the bloodline. And then you go to year 4000 and you see the covenant confirmed with Jesus. And then at the end of the 6,000-year period, I believe that's whenever you're going to see the return of Christ. And I believe we are definitely in those days now, and I think that's why iron sharpens iron is relevant.
Yeah, I have a lot of stuff to say about all that he said. Of course, Jesus, when the Pharisees came to Jesus and said, "Show us a sign, if you be the Christ," and of course, how many miracles and all that kind of stuff had he already done? But he said, "A wicked and adulterous generation seeketh after a sign, and there shall no sign be given except the sign of Jonah." Jonah was 3 nights and 3 days in the belly of the fish, so shall the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. So that Jonah reference that Kevin made is utterly valid.
Yeah.
Utterly biblical. Another thing I want to point out to you, you remember Mike Hoggart, of course.
Yeah, Mike.
Mike Hoggart is a guy that we kind of used to watch, and I mean, he's not a terrible guy, he's not a dispensationalist, I'll give him that. But he actually pointed out something one time that has stuck with me for a long time, and he pointed out that, a day is with the Lord 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is of a day, and that the devil in the Garden of Eden said to Eve that, when Eve said, we're not allowed to eat of the fruit that's in the middle of the garden, and we're not allowed to touch it, and God said, in the day that you eat it or touch it, you shall die. Now, obviously, he didn't say not touch it, but he said don't eat it. But she said correctly, God says you shall die. And the devil said, you shall not surely die, but God doth know that, in the day that you eat thereof, you'll be like us, knowing good from evil. And they did die spiritually. And if 1,000 years is as a day, and a day is as 1,000 years, and this is where I'm going with this. This is what Mike Hoggart said, and I thought it was a really good, valid point. Nobody in the Bible, for the longest day they ever lived, Methuselah lived 967 years. Nobody lived to be even 1,000 years. They died in that day if 1,000 years is as a day.
Yeah.
You dig what I'm saying?
Yeah, it's great. Yeah. That's a great point. I didn't know. I'd never heard him say that. Yeah, that's a true statement right there, and that's something to ponder. That's deep. Yeah.
Yeah, isn't that great?
That's great. It's God, man. That's God for you, man. You're not going to find infallible. You're not going to find anything fallible in the Word. He's
it's the truth, man.
Yeah,
it is the truth and the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Amen.
In fact, the Bible tells us in a couple of places it's impossible for God to lie.
Yes.
So God can't lie.